Here is a statement that should unsettle you. The same biological mechanism that allows a stroke survivor to relearn how to move their hand is the same mechanism that locks an addict into compulsive drug seeking that can last for years after the last dose. The same process that lets a London taxi driver grow a larger hippocampus for memorizing the city's streets is the same process that shrinks a chronic pain patient's motor cortex until they can barely use a limb that has nothing physically wrong with it. The same neural principle that means a pianist's brain physically expands into the territory of neighboring skills is the same principle that means the skills she neglects are actively being cannibalized. Their cortical real estate colonized by the practiced ones. Plasticity, the brain's ability to reorganize itself in response to experience, is widely regarded as the most hopeful discovery in modern neuroscience. It means the brain is not fixed. It means recovery is possible. It means you can learn, grow, and change at any age. All of that is true. But here's what the popular narrative leaves out. Plasticity is not inherently good. It is inherently neutral. It is a mechanism, not a moral force, and it works with exactly the same efficiency to entrench pathology as it does to enable healing. Neurons that fire together wire together, and they don't care whether the circuit they're building is serving you or destroying you. This is the plastic paradox, and understanding it changes everything about how we approach habit, addiction, recovery, and, as we'll see, the ancient logic of monastic constraint practices that science is only now catching up to. Welcome to the Scholar's Fire. I'm Sarah. Let's light it up. You're listening to the Scholar's Fire on the Wired Ape, where every Wednesday we go deep on one idea, one study, one thinker, or one tradition, bringing the full interdisciplinary synthesis: neuroscience, anthropology, psychology, and ancient wisdom. Today is a study breakdown episode. We're anchoring in a body of research, not a single paper, specifically the converging evidence from 3 domains that together reveal the plastic paradox in its full scope. Edward Taub's constraint-induced movement therapy for stroke rehabilitation, Eric Nestler's molecular research on delta phosphate accumulation in addiction, and Guang Yui's landmark experiments on imagined exercise and muscle strength. Each of these lines of research, taken alone, tells a fascinating story. Taken together, they tell a profound one: that the brain's capacity for change is morally agnostic, that every adaptive circuit has a pathological shadow, and that the most effective interventions, both clinical and traditional, don't fight plasticity. They redirect it. The ritual science connection today is this: constraint-based healing practices, from Taub's CI therapy in the rehabilitation clinic to monastic constraint practices like fasting, silence, and enclosure, all exploit the same principle. Strategic deprivation doesn't weaken the brain. It forces the brain to reorganize. Remove the easy option, and the nervous system builds new pathways to compensate. This is one of those episodes where the synthesis between modern neuroscience and ancient practice is so tight it's almost eerie. Let's begin with the thinker. Part 1. Edward Taub and the discovery of learned non-use. In the 1960s and 1970s, a behavioral neuroscientist named Edward Taub, working at what was then the Institute for Behavioral Research in Silver Spring, Maryland, was conducting experiments on monkeys. He surgically severed the sensory nerves to a single forelimb, a procedure called deafferentation, so the monkey could no longer feel that limb, even though the motor nerves controlling movement remained intact. The limb could still move. The monkey just couldn't feel it. What happened was striking. The monkeys stopped using the affected limb entirely. Not because they couldn't move it, but because every time they tried, the lack of sensory feedback made the movements clumsy and inefficient. The failure was discouraging. The other healthy limb worked fine, so the monkeys simply stopped trying. Taub called this phenomenon learned non-use. Then came the critical insight. Taub restrained the healthy limb. He put it in a sling so the monkey couldn't use it. Forced to rely on the deafferentated limb, the one it had abandoned, the monkey began using it again, clumsily at first, then with increasing competence. The limb hadn't been broken. The brain had simply given up on it because an easier option was available. Beginning in the late 1980s, Taub translated this principle into a human rehabilitation method called constraint-induced movement therapy, CI therapy. The protocol is elegantly brutal. For stroke patients with a weakened arm, you restrain the healthy arm in a sling for 90% of waking hours over roughly 2 weeks, while the patient practices intensive structured tasks with the affected arm for 6 hours a day. The results were extraordinary. Stroke survivors who had been disabled for years, patients the medical establishment had given up on, recovered substantial use of their affected limbs. Brain imaging showed that the cortical representation of the affected arm, which had shrunk after the stroke due to disuse, expanded dramatically after CI therapy. One study using transcranial magnetic stimulation showed that the excitable cortex devoted to the affected limb doubled in size after just 12 days of therapy. The American Stroke Association described Taub's work as being at the forefront of a revolution in stroke recovery. But here's the detail that matters for the plastic paradox. The reason the affected arm's cortical territory had shrunk wasn't just because of the stroke damage itself. It was because of competitive plasticity. When the patient stopped using the affected arm, learned non-use, the brain's cortical real estate didn't sit idle. It was actively colonized by other functions, particularly by the unaffected arm, which the patient was overusing to compensate. The healthy arm was cannibalizing the neural territory of the damaged one. Plasticity wasn't just failing to help, it was actively making the disability worse. CI therapy works not by strengthening the weak arm through exercise alone, but by removing the competition. Constrain the dominant circuit, and the suppressed one has no choice but to activate. The brain, deprived of its easy option, reorganizes. This is the plastic paradox in clinical form. The same competitive plasticity that made the disability worse is the mechanism that enables the cure once you change the constraints. Part 2. Delta phosphate and the molecular switch of addiction. Now, let's go molecular. Eric Nestler, a neuroscientist at Mount Sinai, has spent decades studying what happens inside neurons when drugs are taken repeatedly. His central discovery is a protein called delta phosphate, and what it reveals about addiction is deeply unsettling. Here's how it works. When you take a drug of abuse, cocaine, opioids, amphetamines, alcohol, essentially any drug humans become addicted to, the initial exposure triggers a cascade of rapid gene expression in the nucleus accumbens, the brain's reward center. Proteins from the phos family, PFOS, PHOS-B, and others, spike briefly and then dissipate within hours. This is the normal acute response. Your brain registers the reward, processes it, and moves on. But delta phosphate is different. It's a truncated splice variant of phosphate, and it has an extraordinary property. It's exceptionally stable. While other phos proteins come and go in hours, delta phosphate persists for weeks to months. And here's the key. With each repeated drug exposure, a small amount of delta phosphate accumulates. It doesn't wash out between doses. It builds up, layer by layer, like sediments. Each hit adds another thin stratum of delta phosphate to the neurons of the nucleus accumbens and the dorsal striatum. Nestler describes delta phosphate as a sustained molecular switch. Once it accumulates to sufficient levels, it triggers a cascade of gene expression changes that increase the sensitivity of reward circuits, enhance drug-seeking behavior, and create structural changes in the neurons themselves, including the growth of new dendritic spines, which are the physical connection points between neurons. The circuits of craving literally get more wired, more connected, more efficient at driving compulsive behavior. And here's the paradox. This is the same mechanism, long-term potentiation, dendritic remodeling, synaptic strengthening, that underlies beneficial learning. When you practice piano and get better, your motor cortex is doing the same thing, strengthening synaptic connections, growing dendritic spines, making the practice circuit more efficient. Delta itself accumulates not only in response to drugs, but also in response to compulsive running, overeating, and even natural rewards like sex. The molecular machinery of learning and the molecular machinery of addiction are the same machinery. Neurons that fire together wire together. Hebb's famous principle. It's the foundation of all skill acquisition, all memory formation, all recovery. And it's the foundation of addiction, OCD, chronic pain, and every pathological circuit the brain can build. The wiring doesn't care what it's wiring for. It simply strengthens whatever circuits are activated most frequently and most intensely. This is why addiction is so durable. It's not just a bad habit. It's a physical restructuring of the brain's reward circuitry, mediated by molecular switches that persist long after the drug is gone. Even after delta phosphate levels eventually normalize, the structural changes, the new dendritic spines, the remodeled synaptic connections remain. The circuit has been built, and competitive plasticity means that it has been built at the circuit. And competitive plasticity means that it has been built at the expense of other circuits. The skills, relationships, and activities that the addict neglected during active addiction haven't merely been paused. Their neural territory has been actively reassigned to the addiction circuit. Part 3. Guangyi and the 22% that changed everything. And now, perhaps the most mind-bending piece of evidence for the plastic paradox, the one that proves the mind-body distinction is a fiction. In 1992, synthesized scientist Wang Yui at the Cleveland Clinic conducted an experiment. He divided volunteers into 3 groups. One group physically exercised the abductor muscle of the little finger, the muscle that spreads your pinky away from your hand, performing maximal voluntary contraction for 4 weeks. A second group did no physical exercise at all. Instead, they sat still and imagined performing the same maximal contractions, vividly, intensely, from an internal first-person perspective, as if they were actually feeling the effort. The third group did nothing. After 4 weeks, the group that physically exercised showed a 30% increase in finger strength. The controlled group showed a 3.7% increase, essentially nothing. And the group that only imagined exercising? 22%. A 22% strength increase from pure mental imagery, with 0 physical movement. Subsequent research confirmed and extended these findings. The mechanism is supraspinal. The strength gains come from the brain sending stronger signals to the muscles, not from changes in the muscles themselves. Brain imaging shows that mental imagery of movement activates the same motor cortex regions as actual movement. The same neural circuits fire. The same pathways strengthen. Internal imagery even produces measurable cardiovascular changes. Heart rate and respiration increase during imagined exercise, despite the absence of any muscle contraction. This is the plastic paradox at its most elegant. The brain doesn't distinguish, at the level of neural circuit activation, between real and imagined movement. Plasticity responds to signal intensity and repetition, regardless of whether the signal originates from an actual physical event or a vividly imagined one. This is why visualization works for athletes. It's also why trauma flashbacks produce real physiological stress responses. The brain is replaying a circuit that was encoded with high emotional intensity, and the body responds as if the event is happening again. The 22% finding is a proof of concept. Mind and body are one system. The brain imagines, the brain that acts. The brain that imagines and the brain that acts are the same brain, and plasticity makes no distinction between them. Now, let's bring these 3 lines of research together, because the synthesis is where the Wired Ape insight lives. The neuroscience principle, competitive plasticity. The unifying principle across all 3 findings is competitive plasticity, the fact that neural territory is not just gained through practice, but lost through neglect. This is not a passive process, it's active. The cortex is a zero-sum real estate market. When one function expands, neighboring functions contract. When one circuit is practiced, competing circuits are suppressed. In Taub's stroke patients, the healthy arm colonized the territory of the damaged one. In Nestler's addiction research, the drug-seeking circuit expanded at the expense of circuits for natural reward, decision-making, and impulse control. And in Yui's mental imagery study, the brain couldn't tell the difference between real and imagined practice, meaning that the mental rehearsal of maladaptive patterns is just as effective at strengthening pathological circuits as mental rehearsal of adaptive ones is at strengthening healthy circuits. This means every moment of rumination is a workout for your anxiety circuit. Every replayed argument is a training session for your anger pathway. Every craving fantasy is imagined exercise for your addiction. The 22% finding cuts both ways. Why is plasticity built this way? From an evolutionary perspective, competitive plasticity is a feature, not a bug. In ancestral environments, neural real estate was too expensive to maintain circuits that weren't being actively used. If a skill or behavior wasn't practiced, it was probably no longer relevant to survival, and the metabolic cost of maintaining its neural infrastructure was wasted energy. Better to reallocate those neurons to whatever the organism was actually doing. This is why childhood language acquisition has a critical period. If certain linguistic circuits aren't activated by a specific age, their cortical territory is claimed by other functions and the window closes. It's why musicians who stop practicing experience measurable shrinkage of the cortical areas devoted to their instrument. It's why astronauts in microgravity show rapid reorganization of the vestibular and proprioceptive cortex. The brain is ruthlessly efficient. It invests only in what's used, and it actively dismantles what isn't. This served our ancestors beautifully in environments where behavioral demands were relatively stable and circuits needed to be optimized for the specific ecology they inhabited. But in the modern world, where our environment changes faster than our biology can adapt, where novel addictive superstimuli hijack reward circuits, where chronic stress keeps threat detection pathways perpetually active, where sedentary lifestyles allow motor circuits to atrophy, competitive plasticity becomes a liability. The brain's greatest strength becomes its greatest vulnerability. Here's what this means for you practically. If you spend 3 hours a day on social media and 30 minutes a day in focused creative work, competitive plasticity isn't neutral about this ratio. The social media circuits, dopaminergic rewards, novelty seeking, social comparison, rapid attentional switching, are being strengthened at the direct expense of the circuits you need for deep focus, sustained attention, and creative synthesis. It's not just that you're not practicing focus, it's that the brain is actively reallocating the neural territory that focus requires to the circuits that scrolling demands. This is why it gets harder to concentrate the more you scroll, not just while you're scrolling, but in general. The difficulty isn't a temporary distraction effect. It's a structural reorganization. You're not failing to focus. You've trained your brain to be excellent at something else. Rapid switching, shallow processing, dopamine seeking, and those expanded circuits are competing with and suppressing the deep focus circuits you're trying to use. The same logic applies to anxiety. Chronic worry isn't just a psychological habit. It's a neural workout. Every cycle of ancient rumination strengthens the amygdala prefrontal circuit that generates worry, grows its dendritic connections, makes it more effective, and through competitive plasticity, suppresses the circuits for emotional regulation and cognitive flexibility that would otherwise dampen the anxiety response. Neurons that fire together wire together, but neurons that wire together also outcompete their neighbors. That's the paradox. So, if competitive plasticity is the mechanism, and if the plastic paradox means the brain strengthens whatever we practice, adaptive or maladaptive, then the question becomes, how do you redirect plasticity deliberately? Edward Taub's answer was constraint. Don't try to strengthen the weak circuit by just encouraging it. Constrain the dominant one. Remove the easy option. Force the brain to reorganize. And this is where the ancient traditions come in, with an insight so precise that it makes you wonder whether they understood competitive plasticity 15 centuries before it was named. Let me restate the CI therapy protocol in its most abstract form. Identify the maladaptive dominant pattern, physically constrain it, and simultaneously provide intensive structured practice with the suppressed pattern. The constraint doesn't heal the damaged circuit directly. It removes the competition that was preventing the damaged circuit from being activated. The brain, deprived of its preferred pathway, has no choice but to invest in the alternative. Now, watch what happens when you apply that same template to 3 ancient monastic constraint practices: fasting, constraining consumption. In virtually every contemplative tradition, Christian, Islamic, Hindu, Buddhist, Jewish, fasting is a foundational practice. The usual explanations focus on willpower, spiritual discipline, or purification. But through the lens of competitive plasticity, fasting is doing something far more specific. Modern eating in industrialized society is dominated by the hedonic rewards circuit. Hyperpalatable foods, constant availability, dopaminergic reinforcement, delta phosphate accumulation from repeated overconsumption. The circuit is dominant. It's well practiced. It outcompetes the entero circuits that register genuine hunger, satiety, and the subtle signaling between gut and brain. Fasting constrains the dominant circuit. When you remove the option of eating, the hedonic reward circuit can't fire. And in its absence, suppressed circuits, interoceptive awareness, metabolic sensitivity, the gut-brain axis that has been drowned out by constant feeding, have space to activate. Monastic fasting isn't punishing the body. It's performing CI therapy on the reward system. Silence. Constraining speech. Monastic silence, the great silence after Compline, the extended silent retreats of Zen and Vipassana, the Carthusian commitment to near total silence, constrains the dominant verbal social circuit. In daily life, language and social communication dominate cortical processing. We talk, text, respond, narrate, explain, almost continuously. The verbal analytical circuits of the left hemisphere and the social monitoring circuits are perpetually active. And through competitive plasticity, they suppress other modes of awareness: somatic sensation, spatial awareness, emotional processing through the body rather than through narrative, and the kind of open, receptive awareness that contemplatives call presence or witness consciousness. Silence constrains the dominant verbal circuit. In its absence, the suppressed modes of awareness, somatic, spatial, contemplative, have cortical space to expand. This isn't metaphor. Research on long-term meditators show measurable increases in cortical thickness in brain regions associated with interoception, attention, and sensory processing. The silence doesn't add these capacities. It removes the competition that was suppressing them. Enclosure, constraining movement. Monastic enclosure, the practice of remaining within a defined physical space, whether a monastery, a hermitage, or a meditation cell, constrains the novelty circuit. The modern environment provides near unlimited novelty, new locations, new stimuli, new experiences, new information. The dopaminergic novelty circuit is perpetually fed, and through competitive plasticity, it suppresses the circuits for deep engagement with what's already present, the capacity for sustained attention, for finding richness in repetition, for the kind of contemplative depth that requires staying in one place long enough for the surface-level processing to exhaust itself. Enclosure removes the novelty option. Within a fixed space, the brain can't seek stimulation through environmental change. The novelty circuit quiets, and the circuits for deep presence, sustained observation, and external exploration, starved by the constant feeding of novelty, finally have space to activate. Do you see the pattern? In every case, CI therapy, fasting, silence, enclosure, the intervention is the same. Identify the dominant, maladaptive, or overactive circuit, constrain it through strategic deprivation, and create conditions for the suppressed circuit to activate through the absence of competition. This is not willpower. This is not self-punishment. This is applied neuroplasticity. It's the same principle that Taub discovered in his monkeys, working at the level of the whole nervous system instead of a single limb. And what makes the synthesis so powerful is that the monastic traditions arrived at the correct intervention through centuries of contemplative experimentation, without any knowledge of cortical maps, delta phosphby, or competitive plasticity. They observed the effects. They refined the protocols. They transmitted them across generations. And modern neuroscience, coming from the completely opposite direction, from molecular biology and brain imaging, arrived at the same structural principle. Strategic deprivation drives neuroplastic reorganization. That's the finding. And it's as true in a rehabilitation clinic in Alabama as it is in a Carthusian monastery in the French Alps. Before we let this synthesis run away with us, let me introduce the honest complication, because this is the scholar's fire, and we don't do dogma. Nuance 1. Plasticity is dose-dependent, and constraint can backfire. Taub CI therapy works within a specific therapeutic window. Research has shown that applying very high doses of constraint too early after stroke, within the first few weeks during the period of acute neural inflammation, can actually worsen outcomes. The brain needs a period of stabilization before the reorganizational pressure of constraint is beneficial. That same logic applies to fasting, silence, and enclosure. These practices, if imposed too intensely on someone who is psychologically fragile or in acute crisis, can be destabilizing rather than therapeutic. Strategic deprivation requires a stable baseline to deprive from. Nuance 2. Not all plasticity is competitive. The competitive plasticity model is powerful, but it's not the whole picture. Some forms of neuroplastic change are additive rather than zero-sum. Neurogenesis in the hippocampus, for example, creates new neurons rather than reallocating existing ones. Enriched environments can expand multiple cortical regions simultaneously without apparent competition. The plastic paradox is a strong framework, but the brain is more complex than any single model. Nuance 3. The 22% finding has limits. Yui's imagined exercise study has been replicated and extended, but the strength gains from mental imagery are most robust for small distal models and less consistent for large proximal muscle groups. The 22% figure, while striking and valid for the specific conditions of the study, should not be extrapolated to mean that imagination is a general substitute for physical practice. It's a proof of principle, not a training program. Nuance 4. The monastic analogy has boundaries. Monastic constraint practices were developed within comprehensive systems of community support, spiritual guidance, and gradual progression. A monk entering the Great Silence does so within a framework that includes communal meals, structured liturgy, a spiritual director, and decades of formation. Extracting silence or fasting from that framework and applying it as a standalone neuroplasticity hack is not the same thing, and could produce very different results without the supporting container. The Wired Ape position. The convergence between CI therapy and monastic constraint is real and important, but it's a structural analogy, not a simplistic equivalence. The insight is that both traditions independently discovered the same principle. Strategic deprivation drives reorganization, but the context, safeguards, and goals differ. Respecting that difference is essential. Here's your reading list for going deeper. For the plastic paradox itself, start with Norman Doidge's The Brain That Changes Itself, still the best accessible introduction to neuroplasticity, including its dark side. Then read the follow-up, The Brain's Way of Healing, which covers CI therapy and Taub's work in detail. For delta phos B and the molecular neuroscience of addiction, the primary source is Eric Nestler's 2001 paper, Delta phos B, a sustained molecular switch for addiction in PNAS. It's technical but readable. For a broader context, Nestler's 2008 paper, Transcriptional Mechanisms of Addiction, Role of Delta phos B in Philosophical Transaction of the Royal Society, is more comprehensive. For Yui's imagined exercise research, the primary source is the 2004 paper, From Mental Power to Muscle Power, Gaining Strength by Using the Mind, in Neuropsychologia. The 1992 original by Yui and Cole is also essential. The 2016 systematic review, Effects of Mental Imagery on Muscular Strength in Healthy and Patient Participants, in the Journal of Sports Science and Medicine provides the full landscape. For the Taub and CI therapy, the Wikipedia article is actually an excellent starting point. Then go to Taub's seminal paper, Constraint-Induced Movement Therapy After Stroke, in The Lancet Neurology, 2016. For the monastic angle, read Abraham Joshua Heschel's The Sabbath for the Philosophy of Constraint as Liberation, and Thomas Merton's The Sign of Jonas for a lived experience of monastic enclosure. The full Deep Canopy article, with academic citations for everything covered today, will be on thewiredape.com. And for Friday's Ritual Friday, we're taking the plastic paradox principle and turning it into something you can practice. A structured constraint ritual designed to redirect competitive plasticity in your own life. You won't want to miss it. Here's the ember, the one distilled insight to carry with you from today. Your brain is not rooting for you. It's not rooting against you either. It's a machine that strengthens whatever circuits are activated most frequently and most intensely, and it dismantles whatever circuits are neglected. It doesn't care whether the circuit serves your well-being or destroys it. It doesn't distinguish between adaptive practice and maladaptive compulsion. It simply wires what fires. This is terrifying. It means every scroll, every craving, every repetitive worry is a training session. The brain is getting better at the thing you keep doing, and worse at the things you don't. But this is also the source of the deepest hope in all of neuroscience. Because if the mechanism is neutral, if plasticity wires whatever you feed in, then the intervention isn't willpower. It isn't motivation. It isn't trying harder. It's challenging the constraints. Remove the dominant circuit's fuel. Create conditions where the suppressed circuit has no choice but to activate, and then let the brain do what it does. Edward Taub put a sling on a healthy arm and watched the damaged one come back to life. Monastic traditions constrained speech, food, movement, and novelty, and watched contemplative capacities emerge that were invisible in ordinary life. Guangyi asked people to imagine lifting weights and measured real strength appearing in motionless muscles. The brain doesn't need you to fight your worst impulses. It needs you to change the condition under which it rewires. Constraint is not deprivation, it's direction. That's the plastic paradox, and it's yours to use. I'm Sarah. This has been the Scholar's Fire on the Wired Ape. Subscribe wherever you listen. Follow us at The Wired Ape on Instagram. Visit thewiredape.com for the Deep Canopy article with full citations, and explore the Scholars Grove for thinker profiles and study summaries for every episode. Check out Cyvester for the behavioral finance applications of the plastic paradox, because your investment habits are neural circuits too. Check out The Management Messiah for how competitive plasticity shapes organizational culture. Come find us at the watering hole to debate today's synthesis. We'll see you Friday on Ritual Friday for the practical application. Until then, your brain is ancient, your world is new, and your rituals are the bridge between the two. Take care of the Wired Ape.